Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Northwest RISC Summer Webinar. We're going to start in just a few minutes. Welcome to the Northwest Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network Summer Webinar, Threats to the Conservation of Native Fish in the Northwest United States, Radical Approaches to the Intersection of Climate Change and Aquatic Invasive Species. Our webinar today will showcase research on how climate change and invasive species influence the distributions of native trout in the Northwestern United States, as well as introduce the Resist, Accept, Direct, or RAD framework and how it may apply to managing invasive species in the face of ecological transformation. I'm Catherine Braddock, a scientist with EcoAdapt, as well as a core team member and coordinator for the Northwest RISC Network. I'm joined today by my colleague, Deb Rudnick, who will be a co-moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started with presentations, there's just a few housekeeping items I'd like to go over. So as you probably noticed when joining, all audience members are automatically muted and your cameras are off. We'll be able to unmute you during the Q&A so you can ask presenters questions directly if you would like. If you have any technical problems, please feel free to reach out to Deb via her cell or email that are listed here on the slide. We will also be recording the webinar today and uploading it to our website as well as our YouTube. So please feel free to send that recording to any colleagues who may not have been able to participate in the webinar today. I'd like to point out as well in your control panel on the right side of your screen, there should be a drop-down feature that says Handouts. There you will find a PDF that includes a bit more information about our speakers, as well as how you can interact with the Northwest RISC Network. This should be how your screen looks as an audience member. I know GoToWebinar is a little different than platforms we normally use, so I wanted to show you a few features. Right here is where you'll be able to control your audio, see your microphone and speaker options. If you notice you're having any problems talking, if you're unmuted or hearing, this is where I would check first. We also have an icon here that'll make the webinar full screen. This is the questions function. So we don't have a general chat function in this platform. So here's where you will send us any questions you have for presenters, or if you have any technical problems, feel free to put that in there as well. And then here we have a raise hand button, and this is how you'll be able to identify yourself during the Q&A if you would like to be unmuted to ask questions. Quickly, I'd like to give an overview about the network and tell you how you can learn a little bit more about us. So the Northwest RISC Network focuses on exploring on-the-ground management, conservation, and research needs and opportunities that are unique to the Northwestern United States. We focus mainly on Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia, but very frequently take into consideration neighboring states and provinces in their research and management needs as well. The Northwest RISC Network is modeled after the Northeast RISC Network, which was the pioneer of the RISC organizations and the model that we have taken on. Northwest RISC is also part of a larger group of regional networks that represent the Pacific Islands, Southeast, and North Central. You can learn more about Northwest RISC as well as these other regional RISCs on our website. You'll be able to find links to those other networks there. I'd like to point out that the Northwest RISC Network wouldn't be possible without funding from the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Also wouldn't be possible without the input and support from our advisory team. Their affiliations are listed here on this slide. So I'm happy to present our presenters, speakers for today, Donovan Bell from the University of Montana and Jason Dunham from USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center. With that, I'm going to pass on controls to our first speaker for the day, Donovan Bell.
All right. It looks like my screen sharing. So thanks everyone for attending. Today I'm going to talk about research that I conducted with collaboration between the University of Montana, USGS, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I also want to point out that this research was funded by the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And so this research focuses on how the distribution of trout have shifted both in the past and are projected to shift in the future in Montana. I'll be talking about 5 trout species, including 2 native species, cutthroat trout and bull trout, and 3 non-native species, brown trout, brook trout, and rainbow trout. So one major threat to native trout in Montana actually comes from other trout species that are non-native to the region. This includes brook trout, which are shown in the bottom of the picture to the right. They're native to eastern USA and non-native to the entire Pacific Northwest. I'll also be discussing brown trout, which are native to the eastern Atlantic, including Europe, and non-native as well to the entire Pacific Northwest. And the final non-native species I'll be discussing is rainbow trout. They actually are a native species in much of the Pacific Northwest, also called steelhead, but they're non-native in the vast majority of Montana. I'll also may be referring to them as invasive species, and I just want to acknowledge that they're invasive from the standpoint of conservation in the sense that there's quite a bit of evidence showing they can cause harm to native trout, but they also do support a big recreational fisheries. So some people would not likely refer to them as non-native species due to their potential economic importance. But these non-native species can cause harm to native trout through competition, hybridization, and even predation. Additionally, climate change can potentially have some strong impacts on native trout. Warming streams may be problematic as many native trout are cold water adapted, and also changing hydrological regimes, including changing flood patterns and increasing summer drought. Additionally, these two factors could interact. Climate change and non-native species may jointly impact native trout. And one reason for this is just climate change may change the distribution of non-native trout and then increase the amount of interaction between native and non-native species. So we examined 3 main questions in this research. How have the distributions of 5 trout species changed over the last 30 years in Montana? And again, this includes 3 non-native species, brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout, as well as 2 native species, and including bull trout, pictured in the upper slide here, and cutthroat trout, shown in the lower part. Additionally, we examined how the distributions may change into the future, and we also examined what factors could be driving the shifts in these distributions, including interactions with non-native species and direct influences through climate change. We examined these questions using an extensive data set that has been collected and maintained by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. This includes over 25,000 electrofishing surveys collected over 30 years. So it's really an outstanding data set the state has maintained. And the map on the right shows the distribution of the samples, where each point represents a sample and the color shows the time period. And an important part of this data set is the fact we have temporal data, which has been lacking on previous analyses that are similar to this. I also want to point out this solid line here shows the Continental Divide. And the western side of the Continental Divide actually drains into the Columbia, and I consider it part of the Pacific Northwest. And east of the divide drains into the Missouri. And the environment is actually fairly different on the east. It's in the rain shadow of the Rockies, and there's also quite a bit more agricultural land. So there's some differences in abiotic conditions across the divide. So we include the main covariates we examined in this model were stream flow and temperature projections that were created by the US Forest Service, and they're available both for a past baseline period and future 2040 and 2080 projections. So this allowed us to examine the impact of climate change on trout distributions. I won't go into any more details on methods now. Feel free to ask me during the questions or just contact me afterwards, and I'm happy to answer. So diving into results. So this figure on the right shows occupancy and on the y-axis, and this is the proportion of the stream network that is used at least to some extent by the focal species. And so I want to start with talking about the distribution shifts of non-native trout. And so brook trout are shown by this gray line, and they're expected to have a decline both in the, they did decline in the past, and they're expected to show a further decline in the future. Brown trout, shown by this orange/brown line, their distribution size remained relatively stable. And rainbow trout, shown by the red, showed a slight increase in the past and into the future. So now for native trout species, cutthroat trout are shown by this blue line. And so in the past, they declined by 6%. With some uncertainty, so this can also be interpreted as their distribution remained fairly stable in size, but they're expected to show a greater decline of 16% in the future. Bull trout are expected to show a greater decline of 18% in the past and 39% in the future, again by this green line on the bottom. So this is a much more concerning decline for bull trout, which you can see already occupy the least amount of habitat of any of these trout species in the state. And I'm going to be sticking with this same color scheme throughout the talk. So I also wanted to talk about distribution shifts east and west of the Continental Divide. So this again, the y-axis is again occupancy, but this time it's the change in occupancy. So values below 0 show a decrease in distribution size, and values above 0 show an increase in the distribution. And the triangles show the west of the divide, so what's expected in the Columbia drainage, and the circles are the east. And again, bull trout only really occur in the Columbia, so we don't show the projection on the east. So one thing to note here is that the west of the divide is really the stronghold for native trout right now. Cutthroat trout are much more widespread, and bull trout are only on the west. However, we expect greater declines in the future on the west compared to the east. In contrast, all non-native species look like they're going to be doing better in the Columbia drainage on the west of the divide. So brook trout show a smaller and not even statistically significant decline based on this confidence band on the west. And then brown trout and rainbow trout show a greater significant decline on the west and not on the east. So this is showing that although the conditions are currently much better on the west in the Columbia drainage for native trout, the conditions may deteriorate more rapidly unless appropriate management action is taken. So I want to go over a sensitivity analysis that we did. I think it's perhaps the most interesting part of the paper, but it's a little bit complicated to understand, so I'll walk through it rather slowly at first. So this top row shows the full model, And so this is the percent change in occupancy from 2018 to 2080. So it's our future projection. And this top is the full model. So this is our best estimate of what's going to happen to brook trout throughout the region. And so this is consistent with the slide I already showed you. We expect a total of a 15% decline in brook trout. For our sensitivity analysis, what we did is we removed different aspects of climate change to see how it influenced our future projections. So for example, for temperature change, we held temperature at its current value or at the 2018 value and just assumed there's no future climate change to see what it would do to the distribution. And so what this shows is without temperature change, brook trout would still decline, but only by 5%, rather than decline by 15% when we include all the covariates. And so this is really suggesting that brook trout's decline is largely caused by increases in stream temperature. You can see that without changes in flow and winter flooding, so summer drought and winter flooding, bull trout would have slightly smaller declines, but the effect isn't nearly as large as this influence on temperature. And so this is really suggesting that climate change in general will be harmful for brook trout, but this is largely due to increasing temperature. So now I want to talk about the two other non-native species, brown trout and rainbow trout. And so again, these open diamonds show the full model. So these are best projections. And you can see brown trout have a stable distribution size / maybe a minor increase, and a larger increase of 10% is expected in rainbow trout. However, in total opposition to brook trout, we see that when we remove temperature, if we just assume that climate change halts and we keep the stream temperatures we currently have, brown trout and rainbow trout would actually decline rather than increase in distribution size. And so this is suggesting that warming stream temperatures are actually helping these two non-native species. And when all climate change is removed from the model, we see that they're still expected to decline. And so what this means, it's a little confusing, but what this means is without climate change, they would decline, but with it, they're actually expected to increase. So our best projections of reality are they're increasing. And this really highlights that climate change actually could be facilitating the expansion of these two non-native species. One thing I'll point out that's maybe a little concerning is there's been a previous analysis that included the broader Pacific Northwest, and it didn't have a time series component like ours, but it did a distribution projection into the future for the entire region, and they actually suggested a decline in rainbow trout. And so this could potentially mean, if this is a regional difference, this could mean that rainbow trout are the most likely to expand in their non-native range and could be declining in some of their native parts of their native range. So now I want to talk about the sensitivity for the two native trout. Again, the full model for bull trout shows a pretty substantial decline in their whole distribution. And if we assume there's no temperature change, we see that they would actually experience a very small decline that's non-significant. And so this is suggesting that temperature increase is having a massive effect on the distribution of bull trout. And this is consistent with the fact that we already know they're a very cold water specialist, and temperature is expected to have a pretty strong influence on their distribution. And changes in flow are also expected to cause some harmful effects on bull trout, increasing summer drought. And so overall, with no climate change, if we remove both of these factors, we actually expect them to potentially even occupy more habitat into the future, or at least not decline. So this is more complicated than the non-native species because we actually look at the effects of non-native species in this sensitivity analysis as well. And so for these four variables down here, what we did is we assumed that these different non-native species were completely eradicated from the environment. And so you can see that if brook trout and brown trout were completely eradicated, we still expect bull trout to actually have a pretty considerable decline, slightly less, but very subtly less. And when all non-native species are removed, they do decline less, but it's a small effect. So overall, what this really suggests is that temperature is having the strongest effect, followed by stream flow changes. and non-native species aren't having nearly as strong of an impact on bull trout. And I should point out that this specifically is concerning stream ecosystems. Lake trout are another non-native species, are known to have negative impacts on bull trout in lake ecosystems, but we couldn't incorporate lakes into our model. Now moving on to cutthroat trout, the pattern's actually very different here. So I want to start with non-native species. And so this circle shows what would happen if you removed rainbow trout from the entire environment. They were completely eradicated. So rather than experiencing a substantial decline, we expect that cutthroat trout would actually occupy more habitat in the future despite rapid climate change than they currently do. And you can see that brook trout also have a negative effect. So when all non-native species are removed from the environment, the effect is even greater, and we expect cutthroat trout to occupy even more habitat in the future. So then looking at temperature and climate change, we see that they do, without climate change, cutthroat trout would occupy more habitat in the future, but not nearly as strong of effect as the non-native species. And I also want to point out that this is actually partly due to probably impacts of non-native species, because by halting temperature change, we're stopping non-native species from, we're not allowing them to expand their distribution due to climate change. So this may actually not be completely due to direct impacts of increasing temperature, but rather the expansion of non-native species. So overall, we see a much stronger effect from non-native species for cutthroat trout, rather than direct influences of the environment.
Change, again, in ecosystem composition, structure, processes, or function towards some preferred new conditions. And these definitions are coming out of Gregor Skerman's paper in that special issue of Bioscience, if you want to know where they came from. But these are generally the definitions for the different components of RAD. They might vary a little bit from paper to paper. So let's turn to an example of what this looks like. We'll try to combine these approaches for managing invasive species with the RAD framework. You know, we all love concepts, but how do we implement these in practice? That's a question that I always have. So we'll see what it looks like here in practice. And I want to bring up this case study of introduced brook trout versus native bull trout. And thankfully, Donovan provided great background for you. You know that brook trout are widespread invaders. They're native to the East Coast, where they're a conservation issue there. But here in the West, we'd like to give some back to the East Coast in some cases. But a lot of folks like to, they enjoy having brook trout around. They like to fish for them. So a lot of different values associated with these species. Control brook trout is a very challenging enterprise. Like I mentioned before, you can do it in small isolated systems. Larger open systems, very difficult. And you might run into social resistance to any proposed actions, or folks might just put them back without authorization after you get rid of them, and that's a pretty disappointing outcome. And as we just recently learned and know from other work, you know, impacts interactions between these two species are highly variable. So the question that we posed in this newer paper that we have out just out this month is resist in the RAD framework. Is resist the only option to dealing with interactions between these two species? And that's a recent paper in Fisheries Management and Ecology. Okay. So I'm going to kind of skip to the results and spare you the details of the modeling process we use here to evaluate these decision alternatives. But we started off by trying to frame invasive species management decision alternatives in the RAD framework. And we identified 4 different resist approaches. One is to install a movement barrier to isolate native species, in this case bull trout, upstream of an invasion. That comes with some costs and benefits. A second one is to eradicate brook trout early in the invasion, so that sounds a lot like early detection and rapid response. Another is partial control, so maybe that's sort of in the middle process after establishment, or to try to eradicate brook trout entirely. late in the invasion. So those are the 4 resist options. We had 3 accept alternatives, decision alternatives that we could think of, linking those to the RAD framework. So the first is to do nothing. This is more common than we probably would like to acknowledge, but a lot of times there's nothing we can do, and we just need to intentionally acknowledge that as a decision. Sometimes a decision is not making a decision. Another is to increase cold water availability. So bull trout prefer slightly colder water than brook trout. So that could be a way to sort of manipulate the physical environment if there's some way to cool that water down, maybe by getting more riparian shade or changing flow patterns to benefit bull trout without trying to do anything to brook trout at all. And that's a MIM alternative. That's a managing impact modifier. A second MIM alternative is increasing migratory expression in natives. So when I showed you those pictures of bull trout versus brook trout, you noticed the bull trout was a lot bigger. They can become quite enormous if they are allowed to adopt a migratory life history. In such cases, brook trout might be at a competitive disadvantage. So these are 3 different accept alternatives. There's no requirement of controlling brook trout directly. Then the third alternative we looked at was a direct. This is directing the trajectory. We classified assisted migration or managed relocation. There's a lot of words used for this, but basically moving bull trout outside of their range into a historically unoccupied habitat to increase their persistence. And there's a good example in the crown of the continent where Donovan's been working, moving fish from lakes that are bull trout that are in lakes that are threatened by lake trout up to a place where there are no lake trout, but bull trout have never been either. So it's happened already. It's already happening. Okay. To take a look at these trajectories that result, potential trajectories that result from these implementation of these decision alternatives, we employed a 2-species population model. This was done by Joe Benjamin. We've done a lot of modeling of species interactions between brook trout and bull trout in the past. So we turned those models and their parameters, put them to work here in this paper. And so you can see the RAD categories on the left, the decision alternatives next to that, and then results for abundance of brook trout and bull trout on the far right. And what you'll note here is that there definitely are about half of the decision alternatives result in a decline of the native species bull trout. But there are at least 4 that produced an increase, a slight increase to a pretty reasonable increase for bull trout over time using this model-based framework. One of them is a resist option. So the EDRR was successful if we can get on top of it early on. That could benefit bull trout, but that comes at the expense of no brook trout. And so that's a bummer for folks that place some value on non-native brook trout. There were 2 accept alternatives that seemed to work. They were both MIM alternatives, so managing impact modifiers, and the increased migratory life history expression was the real winner here, and that really sort of jives with our anecdotal observations of places where you have a really strong migratory life history expression of bull trout. Brook trout generally live in fear. And then the direct alternative, the assisted migration or managed relocation, some form of translocation also produced a slight increase. So the implications here is that each RAD class produce successful outcomes for bull trout. So it's not just R, which is common in practice, but A or D can also work. So RAD is not just a fad. That rhymes, so maybe you'll remember it. But I think sometimes there's a lot of social factors in play. I'm not going to have time to talk about it today, but we do have honest to goodness social scientist as a co-author on this paper, Katie Clifford, who also wrote a really nice paper in the bioscience special issue on how folks develop different mental models for accepting these different components of the RAD framework. So the upshot there is that RAD really requires social, upfront social and ecological engagement to make it work and to keep all these alternatives in play. Okay, that's all I've got. I'm going to leave you here with a super pithy quote by Albert Einstein, because I don't have any of my own, and my email address there if you want to reach out with any questions after the seminar is over. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jason. I think we will move on to our Q&A. So I'll pass everything over to Deb. She'll moderate that.
Great. Can you hear me?
I'm good.
Excellent. Well, Jason and Donovan, thank you both so much for those fascinating presentations. I see we have a few questions that have rolled in from the audience, so I'll start with a couple of those. We have a question for Donovan as to whether or not you've had any luck influencing management of these non-native species in Montana where they've been codified in law as sport fish, but are obviously hurting cutthroat trout, the state fish.
I'm not. I don't know the details. It's more the management side, to be honest. There's certain regions where they are spending lots of money and effort and having real on-the-ground success with managing non-native species. So locally, I think there have been some big successes. But yeah, overall, as they do have commercial value, it's not going to be something that's across the whole state. It's going to be a very regionally based thing. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but I know that they are succeeding locally in small scales, but other scales, yeah, there's certain areas where no one's trying at all to eradicate some of or suppress non-native species.
Yeah, interesting. And I wanted to pick up with that question maybe with Jason, because you mentioned toward the ends of your talk about kind of the social science component. And I wondered if there was a role to be played here in terms of surveying, influencing, gauging public opinion on these questions of sport fisheries versus native fisheries. It seems to be quite a complicated issue. I wonder if you had anything to add there.
Oh, well, I'll say there's some good work in Montana, and also Donovan, there's some wonderful examples of, restoration, like the Cherry Creek example is a humongous effort that took 30 years. That's one where they were able to eradicate non-natives from a large interconnected system, but that took decades. And now there are folks there looking at how anglers, resident and visiting anglers to Montana move around in response to changing opportunities for different trout fisheries, and folks move around a lot, especially visitors. This is sort of new stuff that's coming out, and the same is true here in the state of Oregon and throughout the region. I would expect as angling opportunities decline that the values with some of these introduced species are going to change. And we kind of have to see that coming in. And I just started up a new human dimensions of fisheries management committee with the Oregon chapter AFS. And I am really hoping that we can put social science in on the front end of these decision-making processes, rather than doing something and then asking them after the fact, hey, did it work? Is it okay? Up front is really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that input. Ivan was asking Donovan if you could expand a little bit more on some of the assumptions that went into the model, such as things like the temporal overlap of different species, other covariates perhaps besides temperature and flow, if you had any of those.
Yeah, so some of the assumptions, so we had a window we were looking at surveys from that was actually fairly broad. So the spatial overlap might not be perfect, but we probably had most stream segments only had probably like a month of a season where they're actually surveying it intensively. Some of the assumptions, we broke the stream network into stream segments. So the surveys didn't necessarily completely overlap because we had to have replicates. So we made the assumption that what we were modeling was actually occupancy in a stream section. So on average, about a 2-kilometer stream section. And so other covariates, for the initial occupancy model, we included a couple other covariates. I think most importantly, we had pretty extensive stocking data, and we had covariates to try to control for the stocking history of non-native trout. And that's kind of to get established like their initial distribution to start the model off. I'm trying to think of other main assumptions. Yeah, those are the main ones coming to mind right now. The spatial overlap one is a little tricky, and I admit that it could be one of the reasons that like some of the effects from non-native species might have been absent. It's just hard to know.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Here's another interesting one from Jamie. There's a question about whether you've been able to consider impacts to non-fish species, amphibians, crustaceans, invertebrates. And I imagine that's an interesting question. Maybe too, Jason, I could ask you to weigh in from the kind of RAD framework perspective as well on that, whether or not when you consider the suite of management alternatives, non-target species are part of that conversation, or can be or should be.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the best ways to eradicate an invasive species is through use of pesticides or electrofishing, and those can be really effective, but they're also effective at removing native species. So you have to be pretty careful. And there's a lot of trade-offs there with implementation of alternatives. That's kind of what drew us more to the MIM framework, and I'm not saying that's the answer for everything. I still think these other methods have a place, but that's where you can run into some major conflicts. Good example in California with removal of northern pike in Davis Lake, that basically shut down rote known operations for the whole state.
Wow, interesting. And Donovan, anything going on in your work or with your colleagues in your region looking at non-target species or other species? I shouldn't say non-target species. Other species, other phyla.
I'm currently not doing anything. I've heard there's another project, and I actually haven't read the paper. I'm not sure if it's out. That's looked at quite a few more fish species. I know there's been work that's included amphibians. Obviously, it's the easiest to do this type of analysis for target species because the data is so good. Like the data set I got would not be available for the vast majority of species. So more complicated analyses like we attempted would be much more data limited.
Yeah,
but I know there are other efforts that have included some amphibians as well as many more fish species.
Yeah, we did some stuff a few years ago, Donovan, looking at reptiles, amphibians, and fish in the Northwest region, only natives, and that was it was pretty watered down compared to what you were able to do, just because they're so data poor.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes sense. I was a little bit, before I go on, I just want to make sure. There were a couple of requests for your emails, because I know those flashed up on the screen, and we can certainly make those available after this. But if you also want to pop them in chat, that's a great way to share with people if you're comfortable doing that. If you can, otherwise we can ask Catherine if she can do that. I don't know what capabilities you have as organizers, but you may or may not be able to. Oh, there we go. Catherine's got it. Thank you so much, Catherine. Oh. Perfect. Covered. All right. Great. I was really curious. Jason, you talked about some of this MIM, this management approach. And I had been thinking about that in the context of, Donovan, your work You mentioned some pretty clear, obvious differences between the types of management approaches you might take with cutthroat versus bull trout. And I think maybe Jason answered this a little bit, but I might be making assumptions about your conclusions there. Are there ways to do this kind of MIM approach or other management approaches that might have co-benefits, even if these two kind of have different drivers? And I was thinking specifically about, I think it was the slide you showed, Jason, that protecting cold water refugia for a bull trout also look to have a bit of a controlling influence on brook trout. And so it kind of could be a co-benefit, even though the drivers are different, right? But there's opportunities to manage maybe for multiple species in this framework. I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
I think so, Donovan. I think your results point to that pretty well. Maybe cutthroat trout, wouldn't expand as much if you really cooled it down.
If we could.
Yeah, and there's work out there on how much can we cool down streams to benefit salmonids, and there's only so far you can go, particularly in larger systems. But it is a lever. I don't know, Donovan, do you have more thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a challenging lever. Like our group's been discussing it a lot, and then we have pretty strong disagreements about what you can actually do to cool down streams. And some of the core regions for these species, it could be really tricky. But that was an interesting idea about how migratory bull trout can actually help manage the problem with brook trout. I like that idea.
Yeah, we have a number of fully invaded systems, where brook trout are in the headwater lakes, and they're everywhere in the network, but nobody talks about them because they're giant bull trout in the system that kind of keep them at bay.
And one thing I do want to clarify is I do think Jason has a good point. There can be some pretty strong variability for the impact of non-native species. I wasn't able to fully sort it out with my work, but it does seem like in the east of the divide, brook trout have had a way stronger negative impact on cutthroat trout than on the west. Yeah. So there's definitely some pretty big differences that we see. So it's hard to make full the generalizations I made may not apply to the whole Pacific Northwest necessarily.
Yeah, that's really important to think about.
It's good stuff for MIM.
Yeah, how far some of these things are extrapolatable. That's really interesting.
There's also some interesting conflicts between the conservation between cutthroat and bull trout potentially, because often in Montana they're starting to isolate cutthroat trout to reduce negative interactions, but bull trout really rely on migratory life histories, consistent with what Jason was saying, for other reasons just besides being more resilient to brook trout, but also for that. So like you want to increase connectivity for bull trout, and at the same time that potentially could allow for invasion into cutthroat trout habitat. So it's one of those tough situations.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. We had a question here. I don't know if either of you want to take a stab at this. A more broad-based one, but a really interesting one. If folks are illegally introducing invasive species, and maybe we can just answer this in your context because there's a lot of potential ways this could go, but if folks are illegally introducing invasive species, is there a body of enforcement that can fine them for the cost of monitoring and removal?
That's a tough call. There's been some work off the top of my head. I'm thinking of work by Frank Rahal at the University of Wyoming looking at unauthorized introductions, and a lot of times those exceed authorized. They're so hard to control. I mean, here in the state of Oregon, this happens all the time, and they don't have the resources to keep up with it. All it takes is one bucket.
Yeah. Enforcement is spectacularly difficult, I would imagine, in many cases.
Yeah, and regrettably, people have good intentions. I mean, a lot of the introduced crayfish here in the region have been introduced by well-meaning educators that didn't want to kill the crayfish after they were done in the classroom. And
Yep. Yeah, there's a reason why we banned some of those species from K through 12 education.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really tough one. Really good question, but yes, certainly. And also in the ERDD you were mentioning too, like even the early detection, like I would argue, and I don't know if you concur, that we have many, many fewer resources even on that end, even though the bang for the buck is much better on the early end. But even when we're thinking about things like APHIS and, you know, border control, it's a really tough, challenging issue.
A lot of holes in the net.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I like that. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. Before we go, I wondered, Jason, if you could just tell us a little bit more, if you know, about kind of what's the future for RAD? What's the future for this framework? Is it being used more broadly by your colleagues? Is it being picked up by other agencies? Where do you think that framework is going? Where does it have traction?
I'm pretty impressed by how many people I talk to who, you know, aren't writing about it, right? That know about it. It's definitely, I think, starting to shift a few folks' mental models, and of course with the heat waves and all the other weather extremes we've been experiencing, the fires in Missoula, Donovan, or over here in 2020. You know, people are starting to pay more attention to it, and I really credit the folks, especially in that bioscience special issue on the fisheries management ecology, the leaders there, Abby Lynch and other folks, for example, for really putting the word out there. So I think it's going to seep in, and you're also seeing some potential policy changes proposed for, you know, making managed relocation a little more easy to do, or more acceptable in terms of you know, counting towards recovery of threatened and endangered species. And in fact, the first fish removed from the Endangered Species Act without going extinct first involved a lot of those. It's the Oregon chub, Oregon Ichthys crameri. So yeah, I'm thinking it's going to catch on, because it has to. We don't have a lot of alternatives in some cases.
Yeah, it certainly seems like an opportunity to do a little bit more systems making, which is wonderful for many issues. Great. Well, we are just about at the top of the hour. I haven't seen, Catherine, there was not anybody with hand raises that I missed, is there?
I
Just
don't
wanting
think
to make
so.
sure. Okay, good. So it's just it's the ones that were typed in, and I think we've covered most of those. So at this point, I really want to thank all of our attendees for joining us, and our wonderful presenters today. And Catherine, if you have any last closing words, follow up.
Yeah, sure. I would just like to remind everyone that the recording for this and resources are available at northwestrisk.org. And you can also reach out to us with any questions about the advisory team or our work at northwestrisk@gmail.com. So yeah, thanks everyone so much for coming, and Jason and Donovan for your great talks.
Thank you.
For having us.
Cheers.
Yep. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.